Hi, I'm Eliza, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the concepts of machine translation and post-editing. I'm going to cover what we actually mean when we talk about post-editing, as well as give you a brief overview of what a general post-editing workflow might look like, and give you some tips and some things to think about and keep in mind as you're going through that post-editing process. But before we start, let me give you a couple of definitions. The first one is machine translation, often shortened to MT, and it's the process of using specially designed software to translate text or speech from one language into another. And there are three kinds of machine translation, but probably the most commonly known is Google Translate. We've all heard of it, or most likely used it, right? So Google Translate is actually a form of what we call neural machine translation. And for particular language pairs, this kind of software can actually work really well and produce very accurate or fluent reading translations. However, machine translation, while it's seen exponential growth in the last few decades, still isn't perfect. And this is where post-editing comes in. Post-editing is the human intervention that is required after something has been machine translated. It involves editing and quality checking that translated output to correct errors, to improve the overall quality of the translation. And we can broadly split this into two categories. The first one is what we call a light post-edit. And in this case, the machine translated output is post-edited to a level that is suitable for an acceptable and actionable translation. The grammar and style might not be 100% perfect, but as long as the main gist is conveyed and it reads well, then the main goal of the translation is achieved. And this is the kind of process that you will most likely be using for your video translations. However, when we talk about a full post edit, these things are more for the media and the communications side of the translations. In these cases, you're going to have to do what we call this full post edit. And this requires making sure that the machine translated text has been post edited to a publishable level. That is, the quality of the translation has to be comparable to a conventional human done translation. The grammar, punctuation, semantics, style, and so on all have to be of a very high quality. So why does post-editing really matter? Well, over the last 10 to 15 years, the quality of machine translation has increased to the point that it's actually a viable and cost-effective option for translation services. And while machine translation has gotten very sophisticated, the quality isn't always flawless. There are, in fact, quite a lot of common errors that will occur in machine translated output. And as a result of this, post-editing is often required to refine that machine translated output to make that translation fit for purpose. So a basic definition of post-editing in the translation context is the editing of this machine translated output by a human translator. And what this really means is that instead of translating from scratch, translators actually use these machine translated texts as a kind of draft translation to then build upon. But don't get too comfortable and think that this post-editing process is just like a general review or an edit of your text. In the case of a full post-edit, it's not just this light review of this machine translated output, but rather it's an edit of that text to a publishable standard. So this is just a general basic workflow that you might want to reference as you're working through that machine translated output. First stage is comprehension of the source text and a comparison of that source text then to the machine translated output. Then identifying any errors. For the most part, you're going to be working with pretty small chunks, so this shouldn't be too difficult. But on occasion, you will have longer, more complicated texts to work with, such as the emails potentially. So the source text comprehension stage is actually very, very important. In step 2, you're working with that machine translated output to achieve your end translation. Step 3 is ensuring that you're not under and over editing your translation. And step 4, your final step, is to do an overall check of your finished translation for any errors in grammar, in the terminology, and just ensuring that the text itself reads fluently. But let's look at these in a little more detail. So the first step to any translation is comprehension. So you want to start by reading and understanding your source text. And by source text, we mean the original text that has been fed into the machine translation software on which your entire translation is actually based. You want to make sure that you've grasped the key points that have to be transferred. And in the longer texts, you might even want to note down any points that you're unsure about, anything at all. Following your source text reading, you want to read that machine translated output and identify any areas, if any, that require particular attention. Whether these are in the form of, awkward syntax, terminology issues, or just a general mismatch between the source text and the translation. In stage 2, you're using this machine translated output to reach your end translation. Using those issues that you identified to work with the text. In longer, more complicated texts, start by identifying any really usable chunks and use them as the basis and your foundation of your translation. In stage 3, you want to avoid over-editing and under-editing where you can. And by over-editing, we mean making any changes to or rephrasing the text based on your own personal preference. If the output is correct and aligns with the translation brief, then you shouldn't change it just because you prefer it being said one way. You also need to make sure that you're not under-editing. And this means not assuming that the machine translated output has no mistakes. There are, as I said, common errors that occur, and any of these obvious errors have to be fixed. Stage 4 is to just, once you've finished translating a segment, go back and do a reread of it and check for any grammar, punctuation, terminology, or fluency issues that you might have missed. Now let me introduce some basic standards to translation, because even though you might not always be translating from scratch, you'll be working with machine translated output, the same basic principles apply to the post-editing process as it does with standard translation. So, correct spelling, punctuation, and grammar rules must be observed. The style must be appropriate and suitable for the target audience. For example, if you're translating an email from English into another language, it has to follow the standard email conventions in the target language. Specific terminology must be consistent throughout the text. The translation itself must read well. You have to choose an appropriate strategy of how to deal with and convey any cultural references that might be present in the text. And if a style guide exists, it must be adhered to. This will teach you how to deal with things like proper nouns. But there are a couple of non-linguistic considerations as well. It's really important to keep in mind who the target translation is for and ensure that what you're doing and what you're translating is acceptable and accessible to them. It has to be appropriate for the context in which it's going to be seen or read. And you also have to think about whether it's culturally appropriate or whether there are features that have been translated from the source text directly that might need to be changed a little bit in order to better fit the target culture. And finally, some things for you to be careful of as you're going through this process. So common errors that can occur in machine translated texts. The first one is unidiomatic word combinations. Sometimes things can be translated quite literally, and that produces awkward or clunky word combinations that might work fine in the source language, but just don't in the target language. For example, in Japanese, you literally say, I enter a bath. But that's really unnatural in English. Instead, we would say, I have a bath. So you want to be aware of these collocations. And if you're ever unsure, a quick Google search can sort you out really easily. In machine translated texts, omissions can actually occur at the word level, where the translation software just totally forgets to translate a word, or it can occur at the source, the sentence level, or the clause level. And similarly, additions can happen where words, clauses, and sentences are just popped into the text that aren't there in the source text. So this is why the comprehension and the initial reading of your source text is very, very important, especially if you're doing those longer texts. The register and the tone of the text has to be appropriate for the target content. The same term is often translated differently at different points throughout the text, so make sure you've got consistent terminology. Words, cultural references, measurements, and so forth can be transferred directly, but in that case, they're not actually understandable for the target audience. So you need to be aware of them. In translating in a limitless interface, you might even come across some special characters or coding. And this is just a bit like a placeholder for things like dates, so that when they are converted into the other language, the correct convention is also transferred. So just make sure you're not deleting any of them. Grammar and syntax errors can occur very frequently, so pay special attention to gender and number agreement and verb inflections. Proper nouns, especially if they're uncommon, can sometimes be translated inappropriately. So just be aware of them. And sometimes some really weird stuff can happen with punctuation. So be aware of what the standard punctuation conventions are in your target language and make sure the text aligns with them. But the final and really important thing to take away from all of this is to just remember that machine translation fluency can be deceptive. Machine translation can read very fluently at first glance, but a more cautious and in-depth reading can actually reveal some or all of these errors. So you need to be aware of them, and you need to be paying careful attention throughout the entire post-editing process. But that's all from me today. Remember that if you have any questions or concerns about the translation process, you can always get in contact with us. And yeah, happy translating. Bye.